Hello, my name is Andrea Bernal Cruz. I am an LLM student at Penn State Dickinson Law. I am currently enrolled in the Manglona Lab for Gender and Economic Equality. For the lab's Witnesses to History project, we are capturing the personal experience of women during a dynamic era in the United States. Today, I have the privilege of welcoming Patricia Pat Gozemba to join me. She's an activist, scholar, trailblazer, and an advocate. Hi, Pat. Thank you for joining me today.
Hi, Maria, Andrea. Great to see you.
Okay, so let's begin. I know you were born in 1940 in Massachusetts. Can you paint us a picture about your childhood?
Yeah, I was born the end of the year, November 30th, 1940. I was born in Medford, Massachusetts, but we actually lived the next city over in Somerville, Massachusetts. And I lived in Somerville until I was 11 years old. I was in, my maiden name was Curran, Curran, very Irish family. So we were an Irish working class family, Catholic. That had an impact on our lives in lots of ways. And we lived there in Waltham. And then my parents hit the American working class dream jackpot, I guess. And we moved to Waltham, Massachusetts, to a single family house that had a yard and, all that. And to my great delight, it backed up on a really gigantic wooded forest. So I was happy leaving the more citified atmosphere of Somerville for Waltham at the time. And I there met some people in Waltham in the new neighborhood that I really liked. My family wanted to leave, my mother wanted to leave Somerville because she believed too many Italians, or Italians, as she would refer to them, were moving into Somerville. So you might get the idea that my mother and I had very different politics, and that was a source of conflict for us sometimes in discussions, but yeah, that's the way it was.
And you mentioned that you moved to a single family home.
Right.
Before that, who used to live in your home with you?
Oh, right. We lived in a two family house, typical of Somerville. They had two family and what they called three deckers, which were three apartments stacked up. So that was a big deal. And my parents they owned the house, so they rented out the other apartment.
Okay. And did you live with both your parents? Did you have any siblings?
Yes, I had two siblings, a sister who is 3 years younger than me, and a brother 6 years younger than me. And my parents lived together. They stayed together till each of them died. I wouldn't call it a happy marriage, but they stayed together, and that was the the Irish Catholic ideal, I guess. But in many ways, my mother said she was staying together because she had no economic independence. If she left my father, she would have no economic independence, and so I understood that. It was our relationship not built to a great degree on love. It was built more on the convenience necessity.
And did she work outside the home, or
Uh,
she was a stay-at-home mom?
that's in when we lived in Somerville until I was 11 plus. She did not work. She worked in the home. Um, when we moved to Waltham, she took a part-time job as an assistant bookkeeper in a small insurance agency. So that was a new thing in our lives to have our mother working, to have her not be around when we came home from school. But it was we didn't think of it as a hardship.
Oh, and what did your father do? Did he work outside the home as well?
Absolutely, yes, he did. And he was a printing pressman. So he was one of those guys who was in the press room at a typical printing place, and he ran the press. And he did that from the time he trained for that work when he was in the 7th grade. He never went to high school. He trained for that job, and he did that job until he retired when he was, I think, 67 years old.
And how was the relationship with you and your parents? Did you get better with your father or with your mother?
Um, I I always had a better relationship with my father than I did with my mother. I don't know what. I mean, years of therapy could maybe help me discover what it was between me and my mother. I don't know, but I maybe I'll discover it this time around for the second time in my life. I went into therapy back in August, so maybe this time around I'll discover it. But my father and I had a good relationship. I was kind of like the son he wished he had. He taught me all the kinds of things that he did. I mean, he played sports. He had a carpentry workshop in his in our basement. Uh, and so all the stuff that he did was what I was interested in doing. My mother was never doing anything I was interested in. Um, she wasn't interested in cooking or domestic stuff anyway, and nor was I. I was really interested in sports and woodworking, carpentry, that kind of thing. So yeah, my father and I had a really good relationship. And then we moved to Waltham, and when we were and it held on for a while in Waltham when I in Waltham when I moved there. I was in the 6th grade. I then went to the 7th grade, and I think my friends took over more than spending time with my father. I met a girl in our neighborhood who was the only other tomboy I had ever known. She liked to play baseball and do all this carpentry stuff too. So I was like, great, this was like a terrific thing. So there it was, me, and her name was Patty, and then all the boys in the neighborhood. So we were a gang, playing sports, going out into the woods, doing all kinds of things like that. But that was, 7th and 8th grade. And then we got to high school. And in high school, it was a different story because we had a whole different group of friends too. So when I had been going to public school in elementary school, and then we moved to Waltham. I went to the 6th grade in a public school, but my friend Patty was going to go to the parochial school and have nuns, and that stirred a little trepidation in me. But then I went to the Catholic school with her, and I really liked it. I really thought it was great. So yeah, that was uh, that was how we went from Somerville over to Waltham.
And you mentioned Catholicism quite a bit. Do you recall what kind of impact did it have growing up Catholic?
Well, up until the time I was in the 7th grade and I went to the parochial school, Catholic, it was just like Sunday, you went to church, Saturday, you went to confession, all that kind of thing. And then when I went to a parochial school, you're familiar with that term, parochial school?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, okay. So when I went to that school, of course, they start all the religiosity, etc. And I roll my eyes now when I think about my attitude towards some of the new apostolic reformation and all of this Christian nationalism and stuff like this. I mean, I would have been ripe for the picking at the time because I really got all caught up in the whole Catholicism thing. I mean, so much so that I thought about becoming a nun. I never took steps to actually do it, but I went to, the Catholic school, the Catholic junior high, and then the Catholic high school, and then I went to a Catholic college, and all along, I thought, oh, maybe I've got some other spiritual calling. But fortunately for me, I decided that it wasn't Catholicism and it wasn't going into the convent for sure. Yeah. So that was my flirtation. It's not a flirtation with Catholicism because Catholicism is sort of in my DNA. I have to say, there's a lot now that I see it. I could drive my car by a Catholic church and smell incense and like be transported right back there to being 10 years old and sitting in a pew in a church.
Yeah, I completely share that with you. Being Colombian, being Catholic is part of more of a culture, than just
Yeah,
the religion. Yeah, I get that.
exactly. Exactly.
Um, I want to talk more about your schooling, but circling back a little bit before we get to your school years, can you tell me a little bit about how responsibilities were split in your home?
Yeah. Uh, my father worked, and then, as I told you, my mother started working when I was 11 years old. Um, my mother was not somebody interested in a domestic role. She cooked begrudgingly, um, uh, and she was a pretty terrible cook. I mean, I know people like to wax ecstatic about their mother and their grandmother and how they cook, etc. I did not luck out on either my mother or my grandmother being cooks. So my father was a working class guy who pretty much he worked two jobs from the time I knew he was working, that he was always working two jobs. He was working on weekends as a printer, doing Boston newspapers, and then he had his regular job at a printing company, Monday through Friday. So my mother did not take to cooking at all. In fact, we ended up calling, good naturedly calling my father Cookie, because he would come home and the first thing he'd do is run out into the kitchen and make sure the burners on the stove were turned down, that everything wasn't being cooked on high and burning, and all of that kind of thing. Because the other thing that happened, and I don't know whether we want to go into it now, but let me try it out on you and then you can rearrange the interview, is that my mother, when we moved to Waltham, connected again with a priest who was assigned to be at a seminary not very far from our house. And my mother and the priest struck up a relationship that lasted, well, 17 years or so. And it was a full relationship. I believe that it was sexual at times. But another big connection, maybe the biggest connection the two of them had, was gambling. So they were always going off to racetracks, gambling, or they were betting with a bookie. I don't know if you know that term. Bookies are people you book bets with. And in the olden days, you would have a bookie and you could call the bookie and place your bet. So my mother would work, come home maybe around 3:30 in the afternoon. Father Sweeney would show up promptly thereafter, and they would begin betting. And he would leave shortly after 5 o'clock, before my father came home, and that was part of what went on. And we were expected to keep silent about that. And my mother bribed us at times to keep silent about it. But yeah, we were complicit in some ways in that whole thing that was going on.
And don't you mind if you don't mind me asking, was it silent toward your father too, or
Um,
just outside the home?
no, we didn't talk about it to anyone. my father, I believed at some point, and at what point exactly, I don't know, but my father at some point, I think, realized what was going on in that relationship. And my sister once said, my sister also felt close to my father. And she told me one time when I was in high school, and I think I was a senior in high school. She might have been a freshman in high school. And she told me that she was going to tell my father about what was going on. And I said, go ahead. Good idea. I didn't say I'll do it with you. I didn't say I'll also do it. I knew it was going to break his heart to just have it said. It's one thing to suspect that somebody is having an affair, but it's another thing to actually know. So I didn't do it, and I don't believe she ever really did. Although she told me she did, but I don't really believe that she told my father that she did. But it was a really awful situation for my father. I felt he was being constantly humiliated by her, and that we became pawns in that kind of chess game. One of the most egregious acts, I think, happened in 1967. A year, both my sister and I got married, and my sister got married in June, and I got married to a man, Gary Gozemba. That's how I got the last name Gozemba. I got married to Gary Gozemba in September. Oh, there he's talking like I'm from Massachusetts, Gary Gozemba. I got married to him in September of 1967, my sister in June. And I remember that there was a big kind of kerfuffle in our household, and it was over my mother insisting that her paramour, Father Sweeney, be on the altar when my uncle, a Jesuit priest, married us. And my sister fought her about the whole thing, and it went on. It was kind of an ongoing battle for about a week, and I was still living at home. My sister was living at home too. Finally, my sister capitulated and said he could sit on the altar. So, I observed the whole thing because I was a bridesmaid in my sister's wedding, and I just kind of saw the whole thing. And then before my wedding, my mother approached me and said, I want Father Sweeney to sit on the altar. And I just looked at her and I said, go ahead, go have your boyfriend sit there. We all know what a charade it is. And I want you to know that I'll know what a charade it is while we're all watching him sit there. So go ahead. So I was just disgusted with the whole thing at that point. It was just like, I couldn't imagine fighting her on that, and I couldn't imagine it was going to happen, but it did happen.
Yeah. And how did that whole situation make you feel now reflecting on it?
I mean, it was terrible. It's terrible to participate in a giant lie. And I was participating in that giant lie from the time I was 11 years old on. And it's a horrible thing to hold in your heart that that I did this. That I really feel terrible that I did that. But at the time, I couldn't imagine anything else. And I never talked after my mother died. I never went back and talked to my father about it. And that's because I often felt that it was so painful for him to think about that. I was all for women's autonomy, women's independence, and then, of course, in the 60s, freedom of sexual expression, etc. Except, what about when it's so irresponsible as what my mother was doing, and you've got 3 kids under the age of 11, 11, and then down to my sister being 8 and my brother being 5. And that was, and what impact it had on us. So, yeah, I have resentment about that.
Yeah, for sure. And on the household, because you guys, you told us that your father had to come in and turn off the kitchen and everything. So were you guys expected to pick up where your mother was off gambling with Father Sweeney?
Well, we actually didn't. I don't know why. I don't know why we didn't do that. When neither when she would not be home, we would come home, or was not planning on coming home for dinner, and we would just make dinner for ourselves. We could make sandwiches, we could do some basic thing. None of us learned to cook during that period, but yeah, we would just on sort of on our own, but it wasn't horrible. I mean, we're living in a lower middle class, tract housing, the kinds of things they built after World War II for all those people returning from war. And, so we lived in a nice neighborhood, is kind of bucolic setting. As I said, lower middle class. So I don't think I have that to gripe about, and given some of the challenges that others deal with, I don't want to make nothing of those challenges that I lived with, but they weren't the worst.
Yeah, completely understand. I have this question. By any chance, did you get the chance to meet your grandmothers?
Yeah, I did. I met both of my grandmothers. I never met my grandfathers. Um, uh, One grandmother, my maternal grandmother, my mother's mother, was great. I loved her. And she was, she's came from Ireland. I think she had graduated from high school in Ireland. She was a bookkeeper. Actually, I never. My mother ended up being a sort of bookkeeper too. But when my grandmother came here, the only jobs she could get were jobs doing housekeeping, like in a hotel residence, and then working in a school cafeteria. And she worked in the school cafeteria a good part of her life. She was very much enthralled with the Catholic Church. She was ecstatic when her son became a Jesuit priest, and she had another son who also went into a seminary. He didn't last in the seminary, but the Jesuit priests were like the light of my grandmother's eye. And it was kind of bizarre, but I don't think my grandmother ever really understood what was going on between Father Sweeney and my mother, but I don't really know. But my Jesuit priest uncle, and Father Sweeney was a Jesuit as well, but my uncle, I think, had suspicions about what went on with Father Sweeney, but nobody ever talked about it.
Yeah, the big secret that was.
The big secret. Yeah. The big secret about the big lie.
Yeah.
We all learn how to live with that now under Trump.
Oh, yeah. By any chance, do you remember what you wanted to be when you grew up, when you were little?
I always really liked shaping things. I mean, I was always I told you I was into carpentry and doing all that kind of thing. But when it came right down to like being realistic and going to college, it was the era of Sputnik, 1950s, 1957, 1958. I thought, oh, I should be helping my country. And so the nuns sent some of us to special college classes in chemistry and math. And I went to those. But then when I got to college, I was like, no, I'm not gonna do this. And I switched my major to English because I loved reading novels and literature. So that's what I did. And so then once I got into being an English major, then I thought, oh, I want to be a teacher. And when I observed how college professors worked, and of course, my college professors, most of them were nuns. But I thought, yeah, a college professor, so I went and got a master's degree. I got my bachelor's degree in English, and then I went and got a master's degree in English at the University of Iowa. And I really and I got the degree at Iowa in August of 1963. And I wanted to have a job lined up. I'm very working class too. I felt like I needed to have a job, so before I got my degree at the University of Iowa, I started inquiring about jobs for teaching. So I tried Waltham High School, which was where I had student taught, and I got a job offer right away. So I had a master's degree in English. I got the job at Waltham High School, and that was the start of my teaching career. But high school teaching is so difficult. I have such respect for high school teachers and for junior high teachers. I mean, it's amazing how hard it is to teach in those grades. So I started realizing, wow, people teaching in college have it much easier. So I knew that at the state colleges in Massachusetts that they would hire people with a master's degree in English. So I applied at a couple of places and I got a job at Salem State. So, and I stayed at Salem State for 38 years. I took the job there in September of 64. And then I stayed there until January 2002. With some times off. I did an exchange teaching professorship at the University of Iowa. At the University of Hawaii, 1997, 1998. And I did a fellowship at the East-West Center at the University of Hawaii for a year in 1995. And then in 2002, the end of the 2001 fall semester was when I retired. It was a great job. And it was such a smart move to go from teaching high school to teaching college.
Yeah. I for sure want to talk more about your job and your teaching years. But I still have a couple of questions about your childhood. You mentioned that you went to a Catholic school. Do you remember if you had a dress code?
Oh, it was a real Catholic school. We wore uniforms.
Oh, and what was it? What was the uniform?
It was like a blue jumper, and a white blouse and blue and white saddle shoes. Could it be more goofy?
And the school, was it all girls or was it co-ed?
There were girls in one half of the school and boys in the other half.
Okay.
So in high school, the boys had Christian brothers teaching them, and the girls, we had Sisters of Notre Dame.
And how were the nuns as teachers? Did you like it?
I liked them. Yeah, I love them. I thought they were great. I was a real nun hag, I thought, yeah, they were great. So I also would look at what they'll, but this was so funny, Andrea, is that I would look at the nuns and the kind of life they led, and then I would contrast that with the kind of life Father Sweeney and my Jesuit uncle led. They had everything. They had cars, they had independence, they would go places, they had money, etc. And the nuns had none of that. So, the inequities of what the priests got and what the nuns got were very clear to me from the time I was about in the 8th grade, so I'm about 12 years old. And so already I understand sexism, like what all those privileges that these priests had, and the nuns had none of them. None of them.
Oh yeah. And did you see it at school because the boys were taught by
Brothers?
priests?
No,
No. Okay.
In fact, at school, we didn't really know much about what they were doing. I was a cheerleader, so girls had no sports. Our one sport was being cheerleaders. So, of course, hungry to be part of any athletic anything, I tried out to be a cheerleader and became a cheerleader. I often say I think I reached the apex of my career in the 11th grade when the 12th grade when I became captain of the cheerleaders. That was it. I mean, I should have retired right then. Um, but you know, that sort of was it. So I don't think that what the treatment of the boys was compared to us, they had sports. We didn't. That really bothered me. I wanted to take physics, and girls could not take physics, but girls could have chemistry. We had really terrible math classes, and the irony of it, we had really terrible math classes. I don't know, maybe that's why we couldn't have physics, because we were all so bad in math. But that was part of what contributed to my not becoming a science major. When I went to college, I realized my math skills were terrible, and they just didn't have anybody who could teach math to the girls. So we didn't go then and have math with the boys. We just didn't have math.
Oh,
Pretty
that's,
amazing.
yeah.
Pretty amazing.
Um, you told us you were on the cheer squad. You were captain. Did you
Yeah.
join any other extracurricular activities?
Oh, everyone that you could join, I was part of it. I loved it. I mean, my home life was so cuckoo, with Father Sweeney in the periphery, and then, knowing the tension between my mother and father, unspoken tension, except that when it would flare up at certain times, but that was pretty rare. So no, if there had been sports, I would have been part of them. But yearbook, you know, class newsletter, all that kind of stuff. Yeah, I was into all that because I wanted to hang around with the people I wanted to be my family.
Mm. Yeah. And you mentioned already that so young you started noticing this differences between the treatment of men and women.
Mm.
And well, you have led a life like pursuing gender equality and equality overall. Do you recall if that was that moment, or if you had a mentor of something that ignited that flame in you that that you wanted to participate and be part of the fight for equality?
Well, I think that there were I don't have one moment where I could look back and say, aha, that's it. But I did end up, as I told you, getting married when I was 26, and I turned 27 in 1967. So a couple of months after I got married, I turned 27. But I I I I think after I was married, um, there was nothing just then that hit me, but within 6 years, it all hit me. And of course, that's not surprising because 1967 was a big feminist demonstration outside the Miss America contest in Atlantic City. And feminists really called attention to all of the differences there were. And of course, there's the mythical bra burning. There really wasn't any bra burning that day. But anyway, it's become known as that moment. But I remember reading about that and being, oh my God, this is really amazing. And then I don't know how much long after that, and I probably could go back and look this up, but I remember reading a book by Germaine Greer called The Female Eunuch. And that book just blew my mind away. That, if any book, was the one that really made me see the gender inequity. Germaine Greer's book, Female Eunuch, did it. And then, that's 1967. And then shortly thereafter, not too long after, you've got Kate Millett coming up with her book. And there were a whole spate of feminists who began publishing or in the late 60s, in the early 70s. And to my excitement, and well, they were very bold, and they were very definitive about what was bugging them and what they saw as the possible solutions to these kinds of problems. So Yeah. So for sometime between 1967 and then 1973 was when, and again, I'm teaching at Salem State. I'm always teaching at Salem State. And, um, and, uh, and we realize at Salem State that women are really getting treated differently. And, it, we all knew it, but in around 1973 or so, some students got a hold of a faculty administrative payroll sheet. And so they had the salaries that all of the administrators and all of the faculty at Salem State were making. And the students published it in the student newspaper. And I took a look at that and I was like, oh my God. I realized how much less money women were making than men when I saw that printout. And like, we were just like, whoa, so blown away by that. And I suppose if there had been a sizable number of people of color at that college at the time, we might have noticed a differential there, but there were hardly any people of color. I mean, I'd be hard pressed to go back and point to them. So that was a galvanizing moment for us in the 70s. And a group of women got together and we decided we were going to file a salary equity suit. But before I got to that, I had decided, I mean, I'd been reading Germaine Greer, then reading Kate Millett, then reading all of these other feminists. I decided that I had enough of my marriage. And that was at the same time, and who knows what was more the compelling factor, but I fell in love with a woman, and that was totally shocking to me. I never thought that would happen. And after that, sometime after that, I left my husband, moved into an apartment, actually ended up moving in with that woman. And so that was 1973. So a lot of things were happening in 73. I left my marriage. I became one of the women instrumental in shaping a salary equity suit at Salem State. And at that time, we were going for some kinds of equity treatment by the Civil Rights Commission of the United States. And that was slow going. And then we worked with the Massachusetts Commission Against Discrimination. And then we decided that one of the things we were really probably going to have to do is file a lawsuit, a class action lawsuit. So we started thinking about that. So that's, you know, that's a period in the 1970s that we went through before we got to that. But and we'll come back. We can talk about a little bit. One of the things I realized was that in order to get anything like salary equity settlement for everybody at the college, we were going to have to look at more than just the women, because we needed men to buy into this. So we looked at what happened to the men, particularly the politically radical men, because in the 60s and 70s, we all got punished for taking part in demonstrations. I mean, for people to think that being punished now for taking part in a demonstration is so out of the ordinary. It's not out of the ordinary. What's out of the ordinary here in this country is disappearing the people, as happened with the Turkish graduate student in Somerville yesterday. So the men who were punished, we looked at their salaries too, and the men who were politically active radicals, so we realized that we were going to have to come up with some kind of computer program that was going to it was going to bolster the salaries of men, some men
Okay.
as well. But of course, there were some men who had they were buddies with the men in the administration, so they just kept getting promotions and salaries all the time. So yeah, that was pretty noticeable about the equity.
And how long did it take the process, the suit?
Okay, so 1973, we started thinking about taking a case. We started filing with those federal and state entities. Then we got a lawyer, a private lawyer, and we realized we were going to have to pay this law firm, but we also were hoping to take someone who would get a firm that would take it on contingency, and they did. They took the case on contingency. So 1973 is when we started on this salary equity issue, and believe it or not, 1988-89 was when we got the payoff. So we're talking 16 years. So when I talk, I get kind of old, crotchety old lady when I talk to some people who they're like, "We'll never get that. It'll never happen." And I'm like, well, some things happen if you wait long enough and keep fighting for it. But you have to keep fighting for it, and you have to keep your eye on what's happening. So yeah, and the key in it was Andrea was forming a union. Like we had long wanted to unionize at Salem State, but I was busy with women. We were starting the women's studies program. We were trying to prop up the women's center at the college. I had come out as a lesbian in the 70s. I mean, there was a lot of stuff going on. So yeah, filing the lawsuit and forming the union. And there were many men wanted to form the union too, which was great that they wanted to do that. They didn't necessarily want to do it around salary equity because they were all pretty happy. But getting the union started in 1978 was when we started the union, and 77 actually. And I decided one of the things that I should do, we had a statewide union. So there was a union comprised of, at that time, 9 state college campuses. And each college campus would send representatives to a meeting once a month. And I realized that if we were going to get any place, we had to crack that, and we had to go and be on that statewide board. So I got another woman to do that with me, and we started to learn the ropes of the boys in the union, and so we knew how to operate there and what we should look for. But so we were on the state board, and then I accepted an invitation to be on the negotiating team for the statewide board. And my goal was always salary equity. So during that whole period, when I got really more involved in the union in the end of the 70s, beginning of the 80s, part of my thing always was building up support in the union for salary equity and for other provisions for women, because the other things that I wanted to see in the contract were, I wanted protections for LGBT. I guess as lesbian and gay was really what we were working for in the 1980s. I don't think any of us were talking about transgender rights and trying to get that finalized in a union contract. But lesbian and gay rights, we definitely wanted to try to get that in, and we get it in tentative ways. I mean, it was a process of accretion, building up what it covered. So, and the other one was that we wanted to get protections against sexual harassment. Sexual harassment was a real problem on the campus, partly for staff, and in that I include faculty and administrators, but also, for students in particular. Students were really victimized by a lot of sexual harassment in the 70s and the 80s from faculty, sexual harassment from faculty. So there were other women's issues, childcare. We wanted to get childcare in, and all of those so-called women's issues, which were also men's issues. I mean, I remember even trying to get maternity and paternity leave, and I can remember sitting at a union negotiating meeting where I had brought up maternity leave for women and paternity leave for men, and they were like, well, there's no way it can be covered under anything with the state, etc. And I was like, well, and one of them said, oh, I got an idea. It can be covered under a health plan, but because it's a self-inflicted injury. I was like, I'm the lesbian. I'm the one who doesn't want to have children. And I'm sitting here and I'm supposed to be laughing with all of you guys who have kids and you have wives, and that's what you think is so funny. Pregnancy is a self-inflicted wound. I'll never forget that term. It was just so appalling. But anyway, yeah. So I don't know how I got off on that riff, Andrea, but that was it.
No, but just to pick you on a little bit, you mentioned you were in the board. Do you remember how was the rest of the board composed? Were you the only woman with the only one you mentioned?
The first time I was one of two women, and the other woman was one who was clearly on the boys' side. She wanted salary equity, but she was clearly on the boys' side about everything. She wanted salary equity, and salary equity was it. She wasn't so interested in arguing for the other women's rights issues. And then my friend from Salem State, I got her to join too. But to get the two of us from Salem State on the statewide board, one of us was going to have to run to be the president at Salem State, and neither she or I really cared. And so I ended up being the president. She was the vice president. We both went to all the statewide meetings, and that was the way that we were able to closely watch the whole progress towards salary equity, banning of sexual harassment, other workplace benefits for women.
No, it's a long fight, but you managed it.
Years, you think?
Yeah, but you did it. I think persistency,
Yeah, that was it.
Yeah. Just to return a little bit to your school. Before you graduated, maybe in your senior year, you mentioned you obviously went to college. But were you pressured by your family maybe to go to college or to get married, or what did your family think about pursuing education?
I wasn't pressured by them to go to college. I think I always had the expectation that I would go to college. I was smart in high school. I got good grades. I think the expectation is that I would always go to college, and having an uncle who was a Jesuit priest who taught in a college, that kind of raised that expectation in my family. However, when my mother got talking about it with an aunt of mine, and they were like, well, why would she go to private school? She should go to Boston State College. It's cheap, and she can get a teaching certificate and teach, and that would be a good thing for her to do. And I never wanted to go to Boston State College. It wasn't that I thought less of it. It just was an unknown entity to me. So having been very comfortable with those Notre Dame nuns over at St. Mary's High School, the Notre Dame nuns also taught at Emmanuel College. So they kept telling me, oh, think about going to Emmanuel College. And I thought about, they also had a college in Washington, D.C., Trinity College. If I'd gone there, I would have been Nancy Pelosi's classmate, but I didn't go there. There was that. And then I applied to go to, because we lived in Waltham, I applied to go to Brandeis University. If I'd gone there, I might have gone to school with Angela Davis. That would have been a real treat, going to school with Angela Davis. But anyway, I got a full scholarship to go to Brandeis. This is so ridiculous. I got a full scholarship to go to Brandeis. I got nothing to go to Emmanuel. My Jesuit uncle argued that if I went to argued with my mother that if I went to Brandeis, I would definitely lose my soul. And that was like something to be considered when I was choosing a college, going to a Catholic college or a Jewish university. So I don't know. I can blame everybody else. It's easy, it's convenient to do that. But the reality is I ended up going to Emmanuel College. And ironically, I lived in Waltham. I studied every night just about in the Brandeis University Library because it wasn't that far from my house. So I had the best of all worlds, I guess, a Brandeis Library and an education at Emmanuel.
And how did you like your college years
I
at
liked my
Emmanuel?
college. I liked all the women I went to school with. And I was familiar with that all women environment. Yeah, so I liked it.
You were taught again by the Notre Dame nuns.
Yeah.
How did you like that experience again? You liked it?
Yeah, I liked it. I thought that they were great. They were really smart. Unlike some of my high school teachers who I didn't really think were that smart. But you know, they were the teacher, and you know, when you're a student, you kind of like you go along with it. But I think that they were great, and it wasn't just nuns because there were of course some priests who taught there too, and then there were lay people, male and female, who taught there. And I didn't think there was anything really different about any of them in terms of how they taught. They were all very good. I mean, I think I had really great professors.
And did you have any mentor during college?
Um, I I don't think that in college I had a particular mentor among the faculty. When I was in high school, I had a particular mentor who was well, for a couple of years, the first 2 years that I was in high school, my ninth grade homeroom teacher was a mentor, and I had a big crush on her. Oh, she was great, but she left after 2 years. So no, I don't really think I got much mentoring from faculty at Emmanuel. I just knew that I had decided I wanted to go and get a master's degree, and I had decided I should go to a college beyond I should cross the Mississippi River. So I didn't go far beyond the Mississippi River. I went to State University of Iowa, and that was also a great experience there too. I really liked it, but Iowa was not for me. Whoa, I was a person. I was used to hanging out, Harvard Square and just being around much cooler places than Iowa City, and Iowa City was just it was the cornfields. It was the cornfields for sure.
But how did you like that experience of studying all your life in Catholic settings and then moving to, you know, um, state school?
Yeah, I actually didn't find it to be that different. I mean, the academic part, like the collegiality, I actually went and stayed in a dorm on the campus, a graduate wing in a dorm. And I really liked all the women who were friends or became friends with. And I liked the cohort of master's degree candidates in English that I would hang around with, men and women. And yeah, that was fun. I didn't think that it was. I kind of. I think now that you asked that question, I'm thinking of this for the first time. But I sort of, no matter where I went, I always tried to build a family for myself, a community for myself. It might have come partly from my own family, which was so crazy and I wanted to get away from. But yeah, I really enjoyed the difference of being there, except for the cultural isolation in Iowa. I mean, it was not considered too much of of a of an ask to go on weekends to St. Louis or Chicago just to get out of Iowa City.
Yeah. So you told me you graduate from your master's around 1964, and
Three, yeah, four.
and,
Sorry, you're right.
and then you go and get your job at the high school. Can
Right.
you tell us a little bit more about how was the interview process like
For the job at
for the
the
job? Yeah.
school. Okay, that I had no interview because
Okay.
I had done student teaching at that high school. So the head of the department, I had student taught under, so she knew me, and no, actually the man who was the head of the department, he knew me. The the teacher I taught under was still there. The high school principal was there, so they all knew me. So I did not interview. They wrote back and said I could have the job.
That's interesting. That's
I
good.
know. It was great. It was great. So
And
that made it really easy for me to just take it. But that also made me think I had luck like that about getting the job at Salem State, because it was, I think, one week after I had particularly trying high school English classes, and I applied to go to Salem State, and I got a I got I got I applied I applied to teach at Salem State, and I went out that summer to the University of California at Berkeley. I decided that summer I'd go out to California because I had never been to California, and study there at Berkeley, and that was a great experience. And on the way back, I called home to my mother, and she said that Salem State had called and offered me a job. And I thought, whoa, I wish I had gotten that job and not my call, not my mother. I hope she didn't embarrass me. But anyway, I got the job. I got the job. And so when I got back to Waltham, Massachusetts, in at the end of August of 1964, that was when I made preparations to go to teach at Salem State. So my first two jobs, the only two teaching jobs that I got there, I landed them sort of by circumstance. And part of the reason that I got the job so easily at Salem State was the dean at Salem State had gone to college with the principal of Waltham High School. So they talked it over about whether I would be okay, I'm sure. And they wanted to get rid of me, I think, at Waltham High. I think that principal might have been glad to get rid of me, because I know I got called to the superintendent. I was called to the superintendent's office one time. This is in my first year of teaching, and I tried to start a teachers union at Waltham High School. I was always big on unions. That was one of the things that my father and I bonded around. He was a big union activist. He always was the shop steward at his print shop. So I wanted to form a union, and the superintendent got wind of the fact that I was one of the people getting people together to sign on for a union. And he gave me a warning, like, this isn't the kind of thing that you should be doing. So it was he didn't tell the dean at Salem State that I was trying to form a union. And that dean was around when I worked on trying to form the union at Salem State.
And now that you mention it, you mentioned that your deans and your principals have been men. How was
Yeah.
your relationship? Did you feel that they treated you as an equal, or?
Yeah, I used to think that they did, until I mentioned that incident around 1973, Andrea, when the students published all of the salaries. And that was when I looked at the salaries and I was like, oh my God, this man with whom I share an office, who doesn't do half of what I do in terms of publication and presentations at conferences. And at that time, I was starting a doctoral program, and he was doing nothing like that. And he was making, like, I don't know, $1,000 more than I was. And at that time, $1,000 was a lot, because we were making like $6,000 or $7,000 salary as faculty members. So looking at the salary that he was making, that was a catalyzing factor. So yeah, that the difference in terms of the salary that we were being paid, that was certainly sure. And the other issues that I mentioned, like maternity leave, sexual harassment, daycare centers, all of that kind of thing, they didn't care about that. So yeah, I guess the salary stuff was the big slap in the face for us. And
Yeah,
we still don't make equal pay for equal work.
that's true.
I mean, I used to think, I used to with my women's studies classes say, okay, so in 1968, this is what women made on the dollar. This is what white women made on the dollar. This is what black women made on the dollar. This is what other women of color make on the dollar. And so how many, and I'd say to them, well, I'm not good at math, so you guys figure out when we're going to have equity with males. What is it going to take to, at that time we used to joke and think, oh, 2001, that's so far in the distance. 2001 came and went, and we did not have salary equity. And 2025, we still don't have it.
Yeah, that's true. But during the 60s that we're talking about, a couple of legislation was passed. The Equal Pay Act, now that we're mentioning it, and the Civil Rights Act.
Yeah.
Do you remember if you discussed it
yeah.
at work, and did you feel any pushback from people?
No. It's like around the early 70s, I mentioned that one of the things that we were doing was talking about forming a women's studies program. And so we did that by, what we kind of pioneered were courses, so we had a women in history course. I taught a women in literature and film course. We put together a women in psychology course. We eventually put together intro to women's studies course and a seminar in women's studies, those kinds of courses. So as we would, like when I read Germaine Greer's book, The Female Eunuch, I mean, I began thinking about, oh yeah, the Equal Pay for Equal Work, that act, and the civil rights legislation, and then to come was Title IX. All of those pieces of legislation were things that women faculty, we started talking about, particularly as we were thinking about doing a women's studies concentration and then building it towards being a minor. Yeah, we talked about all that, and we knew that Equal Pay for Equal Work, that Equal Pay Act, was part of the legal foundation that we would want to make any case that we brought stand on. So yeah, we're well aware of that.
And now that you mention it, when you started pioneering the women's studies in Salem State, did you get any pushback from faculty, from the school itself, or how was the reception?
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, of course, to have a women's studies minor to start any new program always was, they wanted to look at the budgetary implications of that. Well, we could show them that there weren't really big, we weren't asking for budget, because it was the 1970s, and those were tough times in academia in terms of budgeting. So that was why we would, for instance, there was a health class that was offered, and health was a requirement at Salem State. Everybody had to take this health class. So we came up with the idea of a women in health class, and that would satisfy that would fulfill the requirement of the health class. And so then what we started coming up with were courses that could fill the requirements for already required courses in the curriculum. And then piloted, elective courses like women in literature and film, that kind of thing, or those kinds of courses. So initially we tried to make them satisfy some of the requirements that were already in the curriculum.
And the reception with the students, how was it? Did you get mostly females in your classes, or some men also took it?
Mostly women in the classes, and there would occasionally be a man. Sometimes they were there for great reasons, and other times the men were there for not so great reasons. But that was okay. It worked out. We didn't, the courses were open to everybody, and the administration, if we could get other faculty to approve courses that weren't going to have budgetary implications, then we could go ahead. So it was, I mean, we got a women's studies minor on the book. By the time I retired years later, I had lost interest in trying to fight for a women's studies major, because I saw how difficult keeping alive some of those international studies programs were, and interdisciplinary studies. And so I never fought for that. But we got a women's studies minor, and that was very helpful for a lot of women.
Yeah, and you mentioned that you taught the class of women in literature, and do you have any beside the one that you already mentioned, any favorite book or any favorite movie that you taught, that for you it was poignant to teach?
Yeah, well, yeah, I mean, so many that were so wonderful. I often think about The Color Purple, and think about how much impact that novel created with my students, and the film, and how much that had an impact on all of us when we were reading that and we were talking about it. And I would say that many of the Black authors in particular that we were looking at it was just mind-blowing. I mean, everybody sort of in the 60s, we all became aware of Malcolm X and the autobiography, and you couldn't help but we all wanted to be aware of Martin Luther King and all that he had done. But Black women very often got short shrift in terms of the history. And then we had this wonderful example of Shirley Chisholm running for president in the early 1970s, and these other wonderful Black women. So yeah, Toni Morrison and Alice Walker, Toni Cade Bambara, so many. And then I look at like Asian women like Maxine Hong Kingston. She'll always be a favorite of mine. And we got to explore a lot of really interesting things. So yeah, many novels, many films from that era became very dear to me, and still are.
Yeah. And during this time, while you were doing a lot of work and a lot of change in Salem State, you also mentioned you got married. Can you tell us a little bit? You never mentioned that you were very keen on marrying before. To what led you to decide to get married?
The first marriage to a man?
Your first marriage.
Oh, first marriage to a man. Yeah, that's a good question to ask in the context of this kind of interview, because I think despite all of my independent streak and wanting to form a women's studies program and doing this and that, I was one of those women who I just kind of got swept up with that kind of thing. You got to get married. All my friends were all married. My sister got married. So it just seemed inevitable. But I have to say that a few weeks before I got married, I really had done a lot of thinking about it and decided that's it. I don't really want to get married. I don't really want to do this. And so I talked with my husband, my about to be husband, and I said, I've just been thinking about this whole thing. And we had a very extended conversation about this. And I said, I just don't want to marry. I just don't think I'm cut out for it. I don't want to marry. I don't want to have children. And I had decided early on that I didn't want to have children. And the reason why, and I can remember a conversation my sister and I had. We were sort of one of those conversations that you have at night. You're lying in bed and talking with your sister in the bed next to you. And I said, I just never want to have children because I never want kids. I never want to think of having kids grow up in a family like the one we grew up in. And she said, I feel the same way. But I remember we were in high school when we said that. And so a lot of people, a lot of women I've known really wanted to get married, to have children, etc. That was part of it. To find a person they loved, and then you have children and all that. That was never part of a dream of mine. So anyway, I told my husband that that was it. I really did not want to get married. And he was like, oh my God, I can't believe you're saying this. This is so embarrassing. My whole family's coming here, in 3 weeks for the wedding. And I was like, well, I just can't do it. I just can't do it. So that was one day. Next day, he comes back and he says, well, if you really, I think we still should get married. And if you really don't want to be married, I'm fine with, we can get a divorce. Now, that's very interesting. I went right for it, like, oh, I can save him the embarrassment and then I can just get divorced. But of course, I wasn't thinking that at the time in Massachusetts, there was no fault divorce. So in order to divorce, you had to claim either abandonment or abuse. And, that was not desirable in any way. So I don't know. So I never really wanted, right up to that, right before that wedding, I was like, no, this is not right. And after I got married, I didn't feel as if it was right, but there I was in it, everybody at Salem State was married, etc. But boy, did I go for being a chump going along with the crowd. I really was. It really, in retrospect, it really surprises me. But the weight of the culture in terms of getting married, and I don't know, was I looking at it as a good alternative? Is that the only way I could escape my parents' house, to get married? Mind you, I'm 26 years old and I'm thinking like that. This is absurd. But anyway, full disclosure, that's it.
Yeah, and you mentioned you obviously got divorced from your husband, and there was no fault divorce. How did you guys end up getting that divorce?
We married in 67. I left him in 1973. In 1975, he wanted to get a divorce because he had met another woman and he was going to marry her. So I was like, fine, because by that time, no fault divorce had passed in Massachusetts, and a lot of laws that were progressive for women had passed. I mean, that was still the era where women couldn't have their own bank accounts, their own credit cards. You couldn't get a mortgage. I mean, it really was the dark ages. And so we could get a divorce. I found a lawyer, a woman over in the next town over, Peabody. She took the case. And to get the divorce, I had to go out of state. I had to go out of the country. Actually, she had some arrangements set up with folks in the Dominican Republic. So that's where we had to go to get a divorce. And only one of us had to go. And so we flipped a coin and I lost. So I was the one who had to go. So it was kind of scary in Dominican Republic in 1975. I guess it gets kind of scary in the Dominican Republic on and off whenever. But when I got there, I mean, it was like these two guys met me at the airport and they took me to a hotel. I mean, who are these two guys? I don't know them from anybody. And I meet them in this airport and they spoke minimal English. And I was like, oh boy. So they take me for a ride and we're going through these sugarcane fields. And I'm like, holy shit, where am I? But anyway, we finally get to a hotel and it's a beautiful hotel, you know, a resort hotel. They put them up all over the Dominican Republic, sort of like what Donald Trump is going to do in Gaza. Oh my God. Anyway, so I get to the hotel and I go into the lobby of the hotel and there's military surrounding the whole lobby of the hotel and they're in uniform and they've got rifles with fixed bayonets on them. I'm like, what? So I'm there in a country under siege, and there I discovered afterwards there were some other people there who were staying at that hotel who were also going for the divorce, and it was a bizarre experience, but I survived it. I can't say that I enjoyed the Dominican Republic. Sometime I'd like to go back there and enjoy it, but I don't know if I'm ever going to leave the United States again. So so yeah, that's how it all happened.
Yeah, a crazy story just to be able to get divorced.
To get divorced.
Yeah, returning a little bit to your work again. I read a little bit that you did a presentation, a slideshow, in local schools and community meetings exposing sexism in advertising. Can you tell us a little bit about that presentation?
Yeah, I did that in the early 1970s. And I was looking at with these this cadre of women faculty too. I was looking at images of women in advertising and realizing how demeaning they were. I mean, I think till you start deconstructing them, you don't realize how demeaning they are. So I thought it would, I made this little slideshow with another woman. And what we were looking at, she was a high school English teacher. And what we were looking at was, you know, the ways in which women are demeaned in the advertisements. And it was not difficult to find those advertisements. They were all over the place. So yeah, so that's what we would do. So we showed it in, I showed it in a number of classes at Salem State and showed it, my friend showed it in high schools, in the high school she taught at. And then we did it, we showed it at a number of high school English conferences also. So we got the word out to other educators about it. And we were happy to go to community groups and classrooms to talk about it.
And how was the reception? Were they open, receptive, or?
Yeah, because the ads were all familiar to everybody. I mean, they were ads that we weren't going historical. We were like looking at ads that were in magazines that were on the newsstands right then in the early 1970s. And we were pointing out the racism and the sexism, mostly the sexism, but the racism also, and the ageism that was in the slide, that was in the ads at the time.
Yeah, it seems very important, you know, when you're used to seeing it, you normalize it, but when you say, well,
Exactly.
actually, that's wrong, that's when, yeah.
Yeah.
I also read that you co-founded the Florence Luxom Women's Center. I apologize if I'm pronouncing it wrong.
Yeah, it's Florence Luscombe.
Oh, Luscombe. There we go.
Okay.
Can you tell us a little bit about the work that you did there?
Yeah, the Women's Center at Salem State got formed by a group of faculty, staff, and students at the college. And we were looking at a gathering place for women and a place out of which we could run programming on women's issues. and we decided that we would like to have a women's center. So we lobbied for that. We got some space at the college to have a women's center. And one of the women students, an older women student, said, I got the perfect person. We should name that center after Florence Luscombe. And so she told us about Florence Luscombe, did a presentation on her, brought her up to the college. We had her talk. We did an interview with her. And she was a remarkable, at that time, she was in her 80s. And she was a remarkable activist. She had been doing a lot for her whole life. And we were like really honored that we could name the Women's Center after her. And Harvard University, the Schlesinger Center at Harvard had honored her, and so that was a big thing for us to do that, and we loved it. So it exists today.
Oh, that's awesome. That's a legacy.
Yeah.
Also, now, I also read about you that around 1975, you wrote a letter to the college newspaper where you decided to come out as a lesbian. Can you tell us a little bit about what inspired you to make that, to write that letter?
Yeah. Well, I remember clearly what inspired me, and that is it emanated from the salary equity work that we were doing at the college. So I told you that we started in earnest around 1973, and the word got back to me that the executive vice president of the college was going around and he was telling people that salary equity was just a plot by that man-hating dyke, Pat Gozemba. So I heard that and I was like, oh my God, I don't believe it. But I mean, those kind of bullying tactics, that's what we're living under right now with Donald Trump and the others. They bully, they demonize people. So that's what I heard. He was going around, and I heard it from a number of people. And so I decided, there's the best way to deal with this is head on and just come right out and say, yeah, it's true. I am a dyke. And yeah, I do believe that women should have equal pay, etc. So yeah, I was inspired by hearing that by hearing that what the comments were, how he was trying to undermine salary equity by saying that.
And weren't you afraid maybe to lose your job and the repercussions that you might have? Because again, we're talking about the 70s in the United States.
Right. I had no protections. I had no protections from the federal government or from the state. And one of the hopes that I had was that ultimately I might have protection from a union, but that wasn't going to happen for years in the future. But it gave me another incentive to work for the union. But yeah, I was afraid, and but not afraid into inaction, that's for sure. But yeah, but we had a pretty great group of women who maintained support for each other. And during the time when we were working on the salary equity and working on developing the women's studies program, we also, a number of us were in the same consciousness raising group. If you studied the 60s, you probably studied about women's consciousness raising groups, but women weren't the only ones who had consciousness raising groups. Of course, the great Brazilian educator Paulo Freire, he did consciousness CR groups for peasants in Brazil. And of course, this is a time trusted way of supporting people. So I had great support from the other women on the campus around all those issues. And so I felt as if I was attacked for that. Well, okay, I didn't want to end up being a waitress in a donut shop, but if that was the cost, then I was willing to fight against it.
That's very inspiring. Um, yeah. And also, among all of this, it's my understanding that you were also pursuing your doctorate of education
Yeah,
during.
I finally got my doctorate in 1975. So at least that was done by 1975.
And I'm wondering, how did you get the time to do, how did you manage to do all of it? You were starting the women's study in Salem State. You were also getting divorced in the Dominican Republic. You were, you, I mean, all of these things while you were still studying. So how did you manage it all?
I was younger. I was a lot younger. Yeah, it was the 70s. I was in my 30s. So I had a lot more energy then. Um, yeah, well, you can see though how so many aspects of my life played in together. I wasn't working at cross purposes, that I was pursuing that degree. Um, because I had to have some kind of a doctorate, and in the 70s when I decided to go back to school, I originally thought about going to law school because of all of the entanglements and stuff that I saw, and I saw how important lawyers could be. And then I thought about getting a PhD in English. And then I had started taking some courses in education at Boston University, and the line of least resistance was going for the doctorate in education. And so I did that. And I don't regret it. I liked it. It was good, helped me out. And yeah, that you really, in academia at that time, even though there wasn't a requirement that you had to have a doctorate of some sort to teach, but but I thought, well, it's another faculty member at Salem State said to me, you should go and get the doctorate, because, oh, I know, because she came up to me and she said, so are you going to finish writing your dissertation? And I said, oh, I'm so tired of this whole thing and all that I'm doing. I don't know if I want to do it. And this was like in the semester when I had to get that dissertation done, 1975. And she said to me, and these were really wise words. She said, that doctorate is your union card, because she knew I was big about forming the union. And she said, that doctorate is your union card. And I thought, she's right. It is. It's a little protection. And it just makes it a little bit harder for, if they were going to come after me to try to get rid of me, and it made it a little bit harder. So yeah, so that was how I did it.
It was worth it
Yeah,
at the end. Um, and while you were teaching at your school, how was your relationship with your students?
I love my students. I mean, I was a working class student in college, and so I really related to the students at Salem State. Many of them were from Irish working class backgrounds, Irish, Polish, a lot of Polish students, a lot of French Canadian students. Um, that was really before a lot of Latinos moved into Salem. And there was the rare Black student at Salem State. And I'm happy to say now that Salem State is so much better in terms of the diversity of its students and all the rest. And Julie Whitlow deserves a lot of credit for that. She did a lot of the work around that.
Oh, that's awesome. Um, uh, Going back a little bit again, in 1978, you gave an interview to the Boston Herald, in which again you came out as a lesbian, but this time is publicly. And you mentioned your difficult relationship with your mother. How did your family react to this public to this now being public information?
Well, my mother went ballistic when it was in the newspaper. Um, but it's really interesting because my mother's last name, my father's last name, Curran, and the name in the newspaper was Gozemba. So I don't know how she was so overwhelmed with shame about my coming out that she actually moved from Waltham to Falmouth to escape the shame of having other people in Waltham know about me being a lesbian. So that was kind of it. And my siblings didn't react. I didn't ask them, and they didn't react. Neither of them called to support me in that. But and I'm sure they probably heard about it from my mother. But my brother used to just kind of write my mother off, just like, oh man. And my sister, I think at some points in our lives, she might have defended me, but at other points, I don't think she did. So yeah, so the reaction, it was just mainly the reaction of my mother.
Yeah. And during the 70s, all of this, you're involved in these different activist causes. But yeah, do you recall if you participated in any demonstration or in any yeah, in something like that? Like paint us a picture of your advocacy outside of academia during the 70s.
Okay. Go back to the 60s to start, because in the 60s, I was really part of the anti-Vietnam War movement. And yeah, I would go to mobilizations, marches, rallies in Boston. In the 60s, one of the ways that a number of faculty got in real trouble with the administration was because we organized an anti-Vietnam War protest on Salem Common. So that was taking it off of campus onto Salem Common. And the president of the college went crazy about that. I was one of the people responsible for that too. So that, and a number of men were responsible for that as well. So and in the anti-Vietnam War organizing, often I was the only woman who was organizing with the men around the anti-Vietnam War stuff. Yeah, so many of the men who we noticed in 1973 with salary equity, who were punished in terms of their salaries, they were men who were involved in the anti-Vietnam War protests. And so, like in the 60s, the civil rights struggles, we were involved in that too. I remember most of the busing, the busing in Boston became a really big issue in the early 1970s. And so I wasn't involved personally in that, but I was being supportive and appreciative of much of what my students were doing. Many of my students lived in Boston, and they were privy to all that was going on with racial busing in Boston. And I oversaw a lot of media projects that they made about it, a lot of writing that they did about it. And that was very engaging. So there were numbers of movements going on. I mean, the anti-Vietnam War, the civil rights struggle, the women's movement. It was a very heady and rebellious time.
I bet. I mean, yeah, it seems like a very scary time, but also, hopeful with change. You wanted things to change, and maybe you guys felt that you could actually achieve that change.
We did believe that we could achieve that change, and we had a lot of institutional supports around us, which now I fear, and as I see them being eroded, like that graduate student from Tufts being disappeared. I mean, that was not something that we were Black people were facing that in the South, but white agitators like me were not facing it in the North. That wasn't happening to people, to white people, I should say. But yeah, in the South, Black people were victimized by that a whole lot.
Yeah. Another movement that's been very near and dear to your heart, it's been the environment.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about the origins of that passion?
Okay. I towards the end of my teaching career at Salem State, um, yeah, 2000, 2001, I started taking a look much more closely at a power plant that's essentially in our neighborhood in Salem, is a coal burning power plant. And I started reading about it because I had recommended to me a book called A Civil Action. And it was about a lawyer, Jan Schlichtman, and he lived in Beverly, the next town over. And he took a case in Woburn, Massachusetts, and it subsequently got made into a movie called A Civil Action. The movie starred John Travolta playing Jan Schlichtman, and that was very impressive and interesting to people. And and a friend of mine, a good friend of mine, went with Jan Schlichtman to Woburn to photograph essentially the crime scene, where they were dumping all of these chemicals. And she told me about that, and I was like, wow, that's really interesting. So I got the book, Civil Action. Oh, and I know, let's see, and this is again in 2000. There's a meeting announced in a school near where I live, across from the power plant, and they're going to discuss the coal burning power plant. So a friend of mine from Australia was visiting, and my wife Karen, and the three of us went. And Jan Schlichtman was billed to appear, and he was going to talk. And I was like, "Oh, this is great!" So we'd all read A Civil Action, and we all wanted to hear Jan Schlichtman, so we went, and Jan Schlichtman didn't show up. But another guy showed up, and he wasn't quite as impressive, but he gave a nuts and bolts talk about the power plant. And it was the first time I had ever listened to a talk about the environmental problems relating to that coal burning power plant. And I was horrified. I just was like, oh my God. I was going to Seabrook, New Hampshire to protest the nuclear power plant being built up there in the 1970s. And, I always used to think, well, our friendly little coal burning power plant, that's not a problem. But that nuclear power plant that's probably about 15 miles north of us, but in New Hampshire, that's the real problem. Well, as it turns out, the coal burning power plant was very much a problem. And so in my last teaching semester at Salem State, the fall of 2001, I decided I was going to teach civil action. I was going to have my students read the book, and we'd look at the film and we'd talk about it. And that really got me interested, got me thinking much more about the power plant in my neighborhood. So that was the triggering. I mean, I was concerned about nuclear power in the 70s, but I never really thought about the problems of coal burning being a problem. So, and then 2011, 9/11 happens in that right in like the first week of the semester. And I realize, oh my God, this is like a deathly struggle for fossil fuels all over the world. It's like what we're doing to the Middle East to get oil and uranium, whatever it is we want to get from the Middle East. And this is like what we're doing. And so that got me started. 2000, I really took off with my interest in that. And of course, it wasn't surprising that it was in Salem, which was a working class community that we were going to have the power plant was, because other communities benefited from the power plant there. But of course, the polluting industries always go into the environmental justice communities, and Salem is that. So it shot me off in another whole direction.
Yeah, yeah. But still, since you told us, since you started pretty young, you were kind of involved in environment, but when it got close to home, you realized how close the danger was. Then
Exactly.
it took off.
Exactly.
Um, Also, I think this was maybe early 80s, late 70s. You participated in the North Shore Gay Alliance to combat legislative threats to the LGBT community. Can you tell us a little bit about maybe the biggest wins that you had at the time?
Well, I was not the founder of North Shore Gay and Lesbian Alliance. Before it started, not surprisingly, white men were the founders, so it was called North Shore Gay Alliance, and that was in 1978. And I really didn't join with that alliance until 1980 or so. And shortly after joining, I said, well, one of the things we should do is change this to North Shore Gay and Lesbian Alliance. And believe it or not, there were some of the guys who really didn't want that to happen. And I was like, well, why? And they were like, well, we're known as North Shore Gay Alliance. And I'm like, well, we can become known as North Shore Gay and Lesbian Alliance. So it's funny that the sexism resonating even in the gay community, and I came to find out that sexism is alive and well in the gay community, just as racism is too, and classism. But anyway, yeah. So 1980, I got involved with them, and I think that the big win for North Shore Gay and Lesbian Alliance was just being a group of gay people who were out in our local community. It's to be out as a lesbian in Cambridge or Boston, that's nothing. It's Yawnsville, lots of people there. But to have a whole group of people, hundreds of people on the North Shore, come out in these suburban areas, I think that made a big difference. So I think the biggest win was visibility, letting people know that there were hundreds of us on the North Shore, and that we would run events. So we ran educational events, political events. We would invite political candidates to come and talk. Educational events where we would talk about health issues and representations of gays and lesbians in films, etc. But so I think the visibility was the big thing. And I'm still very big on visibility too. I'm working right now with a project out of Lynn, Massachusetts. It's a lesbian and gay project, and we're thinking about applying for a grant to further extend the work that we did over the last 2 years in a project called Through a Rainbow Lens. And it was about the almost 100-year history of gay bars in Lynn, Massachusetts. And so we did a project, we've got a website, we got videos, the whole thing, we did that. And now we're talking about, will we do it? Will we go further with it? And if we go further, where do we want to go? So I'm returning to my roots of lesbian and gay history. And that's always been something that's run through my life, that I realized with women's history, how much history of women was not mentioned in the conventional history books. And of course, that was also true about lesbians and gays. And when lesbians and gays were mentioned, it was usually gay white men that were mentioned. And so in 1980, I was one of the founding members of the History Project in Boston. And that group still exists, is thriving. And I'm happy that it exists, because that's where I can throw my stuff in that archive and realize that it has a place to go. The wisdom of some of the people who were around when it was founded, I mean, we debated whether we should collect the archive at, let's say, the Boston Public Library. But there was one woman in our group who always argued that we should not get involved with any state-run archive or library and put our materials there. because we could always be subject to the decisions of the state. And she was right. It's proved true this year, that she's right, that it can be things can be removed. We saw that in New York when they took out the T from LGBTQ plus memorial for Stonewall. And it's almost incredible. Almost incredible, except I've read George Orwell's Animal Farm in 1984. And yeah, so I was warned many years ago about this.
Yeah, I think we were all warned many times in many dystopian literature
Yep,
over the last century. But
absolutely. We won't even get into talking about The Handmaid's Tale.
oh yeah, no, that's tough. Especially Margaret Atwood is one of my favorite authors, actually.
Yeah, yep,
But still very scary.
yep.
But yeah, now that you mention it, you over your life, you have been involved in many situations where you were maybe the only woman in the room or one of two. How did you manage those experiences? Did you feel any pressure by it? Were you empowered or maybe intimidated by in those moments?
Um, I was kind of used to it because there weren't a lot of women faculty at Salem State. When I first started there, there got to be more women. But yeah, some of the easy defenses I took as I started. I was interested in baseball when I was a kid. I learned a lot about baseball statistics and baseball stars and all that. So that was what all the guys in the union would talk about, is baseball, etc. So I went back to my roots and got interested in baseball and stats and who was doing what. And so sports, that was the lingua franca of the boys in the union. If you could talk sports, you could fit in with them. And the other thing was that I was always a tea drinker, not a coffee drinker, and they had nothing but coffee at those negotiating meetings. So I became a coffee drinker. So I resurrected my penchant for my enthusiasm for sports, professional sports, and then I became a coffee drinker. So those were the defenses. But I would outlast them. They would go after meetings and they'd go out for drinks, and I would go out for drinks with them and I would outlast them. I would stay there
Well,
listening.
yeah, listening. And do you by any chance, how were those conversations like? To what did they have? Yeah, what did they talk about after the meetings were over?
Well, they would talk about the meetings a lot, and that was what I wanted to hear, what they were going to say about the meetings. And then they would, they would there was that there were a lot of stories. I mean, they were a lot of working class guys. So that was a nice part. I could relate to them. A number of them grew up in Irish alcoholic families the way I did. So stories, and they'd start telling stories to all of that. So I think that I would hear a lot of I would call them on their sexism and their racism and their homophobia, but that didn't always stop them from making those kinds of statements. But yeah, I just I can get along with a lot of people. So I
Yeah,
made it a point to get along with them.
it was important
Yeah,
to be able to work together and
yeah.
get your goals. Um, moving on a little bit, during the 2000s, you played a key role in fighting for marriage equality in Massachusetts. Looking back, do you remember what were like the most challenging moments during that campaign, and what did the success mean to you?
Well, I'll back up a little, and it is that the success was wonderful. I'll start with that. But I'll back up by saying that I was never really much interested in marriage equality. It wasn't an issue that I was working on. And back in November of 2003, when the decision came down from the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court, my friend Marilyn Humphreys, the photographer, was photographing the press conference where the positive decision was going to be announced. And she called me desperate because some flashcards that she needed for her camera, she forgot and she left them at home. So she wanted to know if I would go over there and pick up her flashcards and bring them into Boston. So I thought, well, if I'm going to do that, I may as well go to the press conference too and see what it's like. So I went in there and met Marilyn at the Hotel Parker Hotel, and gave them to her. And then I sat there and listened to the conference, and I was blown away. I had no idea about, I didn't know a lot of the history. I mean, I knew the marriage equality movement was going on. I knew there was a freedom to marry movement led by Evan Wolfson. And but I wasn't part of that. I was at the time. I was part of the History Project in Boston. So I thought, well, I'll collect this information and I'll give it to the History Project. And but I was so touched by the speeches that day at that press conference, both by Mary Bernardo, the attorney, and then by the plaintiff couples, that I thought, oh, wow, I'm going to look into this issue some more. So Marilyn, but I didn't do much after that. Marilyn continued to follow the movement, and there was a struggle in Massachusetts immediately. Mitt Romney was the governor at the time. There was a struggle immediately to negate the court decision by changing the Constitution of Massachusetts, that struggle began right after the court decision, and it went on well. It never really got to, the struggle in the legislature went on until 2007, till June of 2007. And, but marriage, when it was granted in November 2003, marriage was scheduled to begin in Massachusetts on May 17th, 2004. So in between November 2003 and May 2004, there was a lot of jockeying in the legislature about trying to get this constitutional amendment passed. And in Massachusetts, you have to call a constitutional convention, get the legislature to agree that a constitutional convention can be called. So they never could get it together to actually get a constitutional convention called and executed in which they could push this further. So there were citizen petitions, there were law cases, there were all of this was happening. But marriage began in May 2004, and we knew once marriages began that, you know, once there were images of happy couples and kids and families and all of this, and grandparents getting married themselves, you know, that would be really hard for the right wing to fight against. But they did fight against it. And as part of that, when Marilyn kept photographing, she kept following the movement photographically and recording it. And at one point, a Black woman who's a friend of ours who wrote the Black Women's Health book, Evelyn C. White, she looked at all of Marilyn's photographs and she said, "You've got a book here. This is the civil rights struggle for LGBTQ issues." And Marilyn was like, "I'm not doing a book. I can't do a book." And so Evelyn, we were all at my house in the Willows, and Karen Marilyn, Evelyn, and I. And I think Evelyn said, well, these guys know how to write a book, meaning Karen and me, that we knew how to write a book. So that was the origin of our book, Courting Equality. Evelyn saying, you should do this. And then really, Marilyn, through some connections Marilyn had, I think, it became clear that Beacon Press would be interested in a proposal if we proposed one. And so we did. And that's how Courting Equality came about. And so the book itself became, I guess, part of the tools in the struggle for marriage equality.
Yeah, that's an amazing story.
Did you ever see the book? Julie and Olga and the kids are in it.
I know, I've seen the pictures.
Okay.
I haven't seen the whole book, but I've seen their picture.
Yeah, great.
Additionally, for this book, you have also written at length about, you already told us about the gay and lesbian bar culture in the 70s and 80s. I know you may have a lot of stories of that time, but if you can give us like an overview of that culture.
Okay. It's I didn't know about it because I think a lot of people who grew up gay, who for whom the bar culture was part of their culture as they were, like, let's say, high school, college students. And I didn't understand the idea of bar culture. I mean, coming from an alcoholic family, bar culture, it really wasn't of a lot of interest to me. I think, to me, one of the things in the history project that I realized about the history that we were collecting in the history project in the 1980s was that it was mostly the history of white gay men, privileged white gay men. And so I said that one of the things I wanted to do was have more research done by the History Project on working class lesbians. And so I proposed, at that time, I was living in an apartment in Lynn, and there was a gay bar in Lynn that catered primarily to lesbians called Fran's Place. And I proposed that at a reunion at Fran's Place, that a number of us from the History Project go to it, and we meet people. We meet women, working class women, at that bar. We ask them for their names and phone numbers, and then we get in touch with them and do oral histories with them. That was my plan. And so a number of people from the History Project came with me, and we enjoyed ourselves that day we went to the reunion, and we got lots of names and phone numbers, although I was much more out there getting names and numbers than other people were. And we had fun at that. And as a result of it, we collected maybe 5 or 6 names that were really good, where the people followed through and did interviews with us. And of the interviews that we got, one was with a white man, and the others were with white women. And one of them was pretty, one of the stories was pretty horrifying, and it was of a woman who, in her teens, she was kind of a tomboy, kind of belligerent, in her family. And her family actually had her committed to a mental institution. And that was always a threat for gay people, that you would be deemed, mentally unfit, and you would be sent to you could be committed to a mental institution. So I remember one of the women, we interviewed her, Janet Kahn, who was the other woman from the History Project, and we interviewed her, and it was horrifying to hear the story that she told of being essentially incarcerated. at Danvers State Hospital. But she did tell one story that is a glimmer of hope in that. And she said, before she left the hospital, one of the nurses came and gave her a piece of paper with a name and a phone number on it, and a name and an address, and said, when you get out of this place, go here and you'll find more people like you. And it was Fran's place. And so when she got out of the hospital, she went to Fran's place, and there was the nurse at the hospital. So the nurse was also a lesbian, and she saw what was happening to this woman, Kathy Clay, and knew that there was something else she might find. So that particular story stuck with me, and it was a motivator. You know, that the stories,
sure.
the really poignant and tortured stories of some of these people and their bravery. You know, she was resilient. She fought back.
Yeah. And also a place you mentioned that you like to build community, build your own family. So maybe that's also a place where,
Right.
community and family you choose can be built.
Right. I mean, that was what I saw, and we all still see the bars as having been community spaces when there was no place else we could go. I mean, many of the poignant stories came about LGBT people celebrating holidays like Christmas and Thanksgiving at the bars, because they could not go home to their families, and the bars would put out Thanksgiving dinner, Christmas dinner, and people would come to the bars, and that was where they would have it. So when we formed the North Shore Gay and Lesbian Alliance, that was one of the things we always did. On holidays, we would have holiday celebrations. We didn't have them exactly on the days, but close to the days. We would have like a Thanksgiving dinner and a Christmas dinner.
Oh, that's amazing. The community that you built.
We had to construct it for ourselves.
Yeah. And you did it, which I think gave great comfort to many of you. Nowadays, I know that you're still active, you're still working on your causes. Can you tell us a little bit about what projects you're working on?
Well, right now, the project I'm thinking about is that I'm working on two projects. One is environmental, and that is about the greening of a Latino church in Salem, San Pedro. And I was asked by a friend of mine on Anuncio if I would, because she was on the board for SAFE, Salem Alliance for the Environment, and she knew that I knew a lot about green energy, and she asked me if I would help out the pastor of her church, because he has a 229-year-old congregation, and I think the church is over 170 years old. So it's a real historic church in Salem, and they need to green the church. It's just like heat just leaks out the windows, everything. And so I'm working on the greening of San Pedro and helping them find ways to provide energy there with solar power and network geothermal. And so that's one of my projects. We call that the Heaven and Earth Project. Heaven for the solar panels and Earth for the network geothermal. That's one project. And then the other one I mentioned to you is Through a Rainbow Lens, and we're looking for what kind of iteration of the next project on the Fran's Place stories, the Lynn LGBTQ stories, are that the next direction we'll go in. So I'm still on the environmental 20 plus years later, 25 years later, and I'm still on the LGBTQ plus, but it's got TQ plus at the end of it.
Yeah, now it includes more, and I think that's even better. Yeah, more difficult. A bigger tent has more
Yeah.
challenges, but I think it's better. It's a bigger community.
Yep.
And I'm wondering, Pat, what fuels you after all these years to continue to carry on and keep fighting the good fight to continue. Um, you already retired from academia, but you still continue your advocacy, and yeah, there's no stopping you. What's your motivator?
Well, I look for things that make me feel good, inspire me. Like Olga, Olga and I are gardeners. We look for our gardens for our consolation and inspiration, both of us. And you know, I mean, I have a real, I think I've always, I think I got influenced by Superman a lot more than many other people got influenced by Superman. But I mean, I can remember being a little kid and listening in on the radio to Superman, Truth, Justice, and the American Way, and I thought, wow, that was great. So I was always impressed by that. That there was such a thing as truth and justice, and we can fight for it. And boy, are we fighting for it these days, huh? So I look for spiritual direction, and in terms of the women's movement, discovering feminist Wiccan theology, witch theology. I was very inspired. I'm very inspired by women who are looking at other ways of tapping into the spiritual. And over the last, I don't know, it's probably 30 plus years, I've been interested in Buddhism. And so more recently, I think COVID kicked up my real interest in Buddhism again. I started listening to a lot of tapes, and I started going to a lot of workshops and online. And one of the workshops that I've gone to twice now, and I'm going to a reunion, I guess April 5th, online, Zen and the Art of Saving the Planet. I'm very much interested in the Vietnamese Buddhist monk, Thich Nhat Hanh. I've been interested in him for a long time, since the Vietnam War days. And so I rely on that. I mean, I think that the Dianic Wiccan thing became part of me, and starting in 2009 again. And then I think COVID has really kicked up my interest again in Zen Buddhism. So those things, and just looking for beauty, going out there every day and finding a beautiful flower or a beautiful tree or something great to look at, a beautiful sunset, whatever. I find a lot of inspiration from nature, and that motivates me a lot. I've never been motivated really by working for money and stuff like that. So taking part-time jobs, trying to earn money I'd much rather volunteer than go and work at part-time jobs.
That's so inspiring to hear. I started our interview describing you as a lifelong activist, scholar, a trailblazer, and an advocate. How would you describe yourself?
This is really hard to ask somebody with a bad self-impression, bad self-image, to ask them what they think. I think all of those things that you said are true. I think that I've heard them said about me enough that I'm beginning to think they're true.
Well, I think if you don't say it, I can say it. I think they're 100%, 100% true.
It's very sweet of you. Thank you.
And also looking back at all that you've experienced in your life and achieved, what makes you more proud of your younger self?
By younger, what What do you mean? What age are you
Mm,
thinking about? Because younger to an 84-year-old could be when I was 75.
I know. Well, I don't know. Maybe what makes you more proud of yourself? You choose the era.
Is that I've never really been intimidated by power. You know, I just when they talk about when I first heard that expression, speak truth to power, I thought, yeah, that's what I've always tried to do, speak truth to power. And yeah, I think that's it, speak truth to power. And if more Republicans would do that right now in Congress, this country would not be so problematic. Where are the people who have courage to speak truth to power? I mean, there's so much. I mean, it's just maddening in some ways, having read, you know, I don't know if you ever read 1984 or Brave New World, but those books are like, you know, 2 + 2 = 5, and everybody believes it, you know, and I was like, this can't be happening, but it's happening here. And I find it frightening. I find it frightening. It's not going to make me stop. Although my friend Marilyn told me that as she's been going to the demos in Boston, taking pictures of people at the demos, you know, which is important to do to encourage us all to
Mhm.
keep doing it. And she said more and more people are holding the signs in front of their faces. They don't want, or they're wearing masks and holding the signs in front of their faces. So that's kind of sad to think about it. When we went to a Tesla takedown stand up yesterday, I know Karen was, at one point, I was taking some pictures to post them, and Karen was holding the sign in front of her face. And I said, are you doing that to kind of disguise yourself? And she said, I certainly am. And I was like, oh, well, okay.
Yeah. But what do you say? You say that that's something you've always done. You've always held yourself.
Yep.
Yeah.
I have to say that it gets a little bit, you know, it gets a little bit more intimidating as I get older and more frail. Like I can't really run as fast away from somebody as I used to be able to run away from people, or as I used to be able to run on the tennis court. But you know, I think you just have to do what you think is right. And hope that you've got good allies. And I feel blessed that I have always had great allies, great friends. And my wife has been a great partner for me. She's an activist too, a writer. And you know, it's great to have a relationship like that. I mean, I wish everybody had as simpatico a relationship as we do, you know?
Yeah, that's great. You finally got that family you've always been building,
Yeah,
and
great.
that support, which I think it's
It's
incredible.
great. Yep.
Um, so Pat, as we close our interview, I honestly want to thank you for sharing your story with me and our audience. It was a pleasure to hear it from you. I've been reading about you a lot during these past days, but to hear it from you firsthand is amazing. And I'm very excited about the impact that your story will have in our audience and in our project.
Great. I hope it inspires other people to do the same thing.